The UNESCO adopted an agreement in 2006 in which they refer to cultural tourism. This whole idea of cultural tourism has not been around for a long time, and it says cultural tourism is the tourism whose goal is to, among others, become knowledgeable about artistic and historical monuments and the influence they have had, and it contributes to satisfy the ends it requires to be protected. And this is a right. And that's why efforts to maintain and protect the heritage of the countries is important in order to bear in mind the advantages it provides to the entire society. And I think that the way in which things have been done up until now, it is not very good, but it gives you a general idea of what it is that they're trying to do. And this leads me to Cook, who in 1841, as the defendant must know, Thomas Cook said that train trips could be used to ensure social change. And therefore, he began the first of those trips that would take place between two cities in England. 178 years later, and as the oldest travel agency in the world, it went into bankruptcy. It left 5 planes on the ground, affected thousands of people traveling, thousands of jobs were lost, and the Civil Aviation Organization in the UK had to make efforts to repatriate its members of its population who were enjoying their vacations outside of the country. So those are points that you have to bear in mind. The bankruptcy of Thomas Cook was very significant. And the reason this happened was because the competition from agencies on the internet made the large number of branches, buildings, and employees be unable to compete with the cultural tourism competition. The UK has had a very hot summer, and then they had a lot of problems with Brexit, but in fact this was a terrible event for the British. We were talking about the successful models that have been developed in which if you don't have spectacular architecture, nobody wants to come, and it emulates those models, and it means that by appealing to people and attracting people to these types of buildings, for example, think about the Louvre Carousel, which looks like a shopping mall, and leads to us having less money for cultural programs, and instead is being used to maintain certain types of programs. Perhaps what is happening with museums is what happened to Thomas Cook, that we're spending so much on physical infrastructure, and we're trying to create appealing spaces that are also monumental, make museums at some point be unavoidably irrelevant and destroy what we were familiar with. We know that tourism is very helpful for the economy of museums, but we're not playing tourism right now. Rather, we believe that it's important to know that if museums are adapting to the simplistic and demands of certain entities, and therefore they should be judged guilty, or if that's an alarmist point of view, and that we have to help all museums no matter what their expectations are, and to find a way to accommodate the tastes of the tourists. Ana Mantecón will be acting as the prosecution, and the defense will be the director of the UK Museums Association, Sharon Hill. They will both present 3 witnesses who will explain their cases, and you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, will determine whether the museums that adapt to the demands of tourism are guilty or innocent. And to that end, we've given you all a token. Do you all have a token with you? Yes? Some people said no. And there will be 2 boxes. And remember, you can't be prejudiced, but after hearing the witnesses and our distinguished colleagues, you will put your token into the corresponding box of guilty or innocent. But this won't take place until the end of the process. Now I'd like to the end of the proceedings. Now I'd like to hand the floor to the prosecution. Good morning, honorable judge and audience. It's not easy to put tourism on trial. It's played a very important role in during the second half of this 20th century. How can we question that whether they produce wealth and jobs? They've helped us to restore spaces in our museums. It provides resources that revive economies that are going downhill. In 2018 alone, 670 million tourists all over the world created income worth billions of dollars. And yet, tourism also has a negative impact on our museums that have become modern centers of pilgrimages, now that some of their objects have become sacred relics. Just a few months ago, in May, what's more of this year, the Louvre had a strike. The workers said that they had a right to retire, especially in light of the little few tools that they had to deal with so many tourists that were coming in, and it made it impossible for anybody to be able to get a selfie of themselves in front of the Mona Lisa. The museums have attracted more than 100 million people to their doors last year. And so, Your Honor, I would like to talk a little bit about the background information and analyze this case that we're dealing with today. The relationship between museums and tourism is nothing new. Our heritage has been one of the main reasons that trips have been made, but in the last half of the previous century, the massification of tourism has led to qualitative and quantitative changes in that relationship. But can we attribute all of the problems that we currently have on tourism? Honorable Judge, I would like you to please bear in mind that this problem is not just because of mass tourism, but it also has a lot to do with the neoliberal economic model that has affected us. We have fewer and fewer funds. There are a lot of economic pressures on us, and we are looking at things in a very mercantile point of view, and it leads us to have different types of offerings for our audience and public. The states are also playing a different role in sponsoring this type of event. And so oftentimes we are subject to a stranglehold with regard to our budget, and there have been cutbacks that have been much more significant for smaller museums. There's also the commercial impact that has turned museums into companies and that has turned cultural assets into merchandises, focusing only on the entrepreneurial point of view when talking about how they work and what their results are. There are a lot of negative impacts that have had a significant effect on the foundations of our museum, and that has led to an identity crisis in our museums. There have been a series of perversions. For example, the fact that we just focus on numbers, the idea of trying to pull in as many viewers as possible, to try to focus much more on quantitative matters, much more so than on qualitative matters. Museums are interested in bringing in more people into the museums instead of leaving a bit of the museums in our people. and everybody is very concerned about the success of their programs because they're concerned about the future of their museums. In the past, there were solitary adventurers who were interested in looking at our museums, but now there are masses of people. Francis Kilberg in the 19th century said that of all the animals, the most damaging are tourists. But not everything is bad news. There has been a revolution in telecommunications, in which television has now played a very important role and changed what we do on a daily basis and our perception of reality. We look at everything as spectators, and we look at everything as a source of entertainment. And here I'm referring to museums, concentration camps, and we all become tourists in a way. There is a closer relationship between museums, trade, and tourism, and that's why large museums become much more like malls, and malls become much more like museums. Museums position themselves as tourism products or a source of entertainment, adapting to the new demands so as to not be marginalized. The same thing applies for sanctuaries. Think of Montserrat and Lourdes, in which they are not just sources of pilgrimages for the believers, but also points of tourism. Large cities are very similar amongst themselves in the sense that they all focus on multinational brands and they always want to appeal to bring in more people. What can we do? Everybody wants to provide spectacles that are easy to digest for tired tourists. Tourists travel more and more towards new horizons because it's easier for them to travel thanks to globalization and because of an increase in the purchasing power of the middle class in the developed world, but they don't realize what impact they have. And that has led to a series of vices such as giving too much importance to novelty and shows, which is forcing museums to develop in that sense so that they can continue to grow. They focus too much sometimes on the architecture, in which perhaps they don't bear in mind the needs of the museum itself. And then there are other vices, for example, in which they select a piece as to whether it can be appealing to the tourists, and this has led to the impoverishment of the content in our museums, and instead we're trying to entertain the masses and satisfy the appetite of the tourists. The danger here is that the decision-making processes of museums will no longer be motivated by identity. Our identity, which has been the foundation in the past for our museums, and it has now instead become the need to focus on the others, in which we are focusing on the tourists. I would like to conclude my remarks, Your Honor, by saying that the fact that we're trying to focus in bringing in more visitors makes museums unfeasible. It puts our works at risk. It makes it more difficult for us to communicate with the people, and it goes against the basic principle of trying to provide the public with a quality experience that requires observation, conversation, pleasure, an intellectual and emotional experience, which requires time and space, something that that tourism does not allow us to provide. Thank you. I'd like to thank the prosecution for her comment. She says that we need more time and space, and I'm glad to see that she finished in a very timely fashion. Now let's move on to the defense. Rather, we'll listen now to the witnesses. We'll listen to Ulla Holmquist, who is the first witness for the prosecution. Your Honor, members of the jury, the prosecution and the defense, I didn't want to participate here, but I have been forced to come so as to not become an accomplice. And I must admit as well that I will try to avoid involving my feelings so that you won't ultimately view me as a witness for the defense. But I would like to say that I'm a witness to a relationship that many believe is very tense. Yes, I am aware that there is a lot of tension in the relationship that we have, but Your Honor, what relationship is perfect? I've grown up in this relationship. I am the daughter of this relationship. I've seen the opposition of the families, but yet everything has turned out well. This relationship that was initially somewhat delicate, but I would also add that there is a lot of love in the relationship as well, and the children of this relationship have grown, and now we see that there have been some misunderstandings, or perhaps we're tired, or perhaps in light of the tension, it seems the easy way out in which everybody will take their own path without talking to each other anymore. Perhaps we've lost the magic, and therefore we should find a way to speak to each other with kind words. There's a lot been said about the possible divorce, but I believe, Your Honor, that before we separate, that we try to find a way to solve the problem. And you mentioned this yesterday. And perhaps go to couples therapy. We might have problems in the future, but we can face them head on to find a solution to them. And I would like to begin by saying that I grew within this relationship. My mother, the museum, came into the relationship with a great, very valuable heritage, well cared for. And man of the world who was well-traveled, cosmopolitan, spoke several languages. They fell in love with each other, but it was not love at first sight. Not at all. My mother initially had a very low view of my father. She could spend hours looking at all of her heritage, and she was so familiar with all of her assets, whereas he was curious, and he was in love with her museum and her dowry and the beauty of it. My mother spoke to him in Archeo-English. Unfortunately, he didn't speak Archeo-English, and that was a terrible situation. But my father, who did speak the 6 most spoken languages in the world, managed to convince her that since she was such an intelligent woman, she could learn other languages and stop talking in that language, which was only spoken by 0.00001% of the world's population. He would listen to her stories, and he was very interested in her because he wanted to win her over and be accepted by her family and have her inheritance. Slowly, she started to respond to his efforts, and she didn't just talk about what she found in the books in the library, but also she started to talk about what she had learned as a child and everything that she had imagined about her heritage, what she thought they represented. And so those were gatherings in which other people got involved. Their friends came along as well to eat and enjoy the museum. And little by little, my mother grew, and she became a true storyteller. Beautiful stories, seductive stories. And she enjoyed the look on my father's face, because they would see that there were a lot of people who would be willing to listen to her, to talk to her, to sing with her, to eat with her. My mother's charm had gone beyond the borders. People from all over the world wanted to meet her and learn her stories, and the house would be filled with stories. And it was a very good economy, because my father would organize all of the tours. He made an enormous effort to ensure hospitality, and we were all involved in are working on this in our home, in which it wasn't just a matter of talking about what my mother knew, but also talking about other stories in other eras. But something happened. The grandchildren came in and they started to come into my parents' home, and they ran around the house, and they would laugh and they would move things around, and they would pose questions that were difficult to answer, and they would bring their friends over to play at home as well and talk with their grandmother. And so I saw that things started to change. I really noticed that things started to change because she was no longer enjoying herself. She didn't have her own space. She wasn't able to control her space, and then she started to become very anxious. My dad decided that he would tell his stories because he was also very familiar with them. He had heard them so many times. He could repeat those stories, and he was a louder when expressing himself. He could deal with a loud groups of people that would come in more so than my mother, and so he managed to continue to bring people into the museum. And in this home, we continue to create novel situations in which my mother learned my father's languages, and my father continued to motivate my mother. But now it's very quiet. There's this threat that the experience of the guests and the family are no longer connected. There's no longer connection. They no longer coexist. I cannot deny that that happens, but my mother's still there.
My mother, I mean, she will want to use all her creativity. I have the witness and this responsibility, Your Honor, to tell you that she knows that there's a problem at home, and that is a problem that she will be facing with the same creativity that she has to tell her stories. And I am certain that my mother will, as my father and his friends said, to sit down, and she will invite friends, and by having the language of emotions will make them to tell their own stories. My mom, as you said yesterday, she will face this problem because that are called museum or musea will be responsible. There are tensions, Miss Honor, jury, of course there are tensions, but I cannot say that it's a toxic relationship. It's a relationship that has the tension of a human. I mean, your time is up. Sorry. I mean, about this coexistence, and that's what will help us to solve this problem and to have this new heritage, I hope, without having to break up the marriage. Our next witness from the prosecution from Mexico, Damián, Ortiz, Maciel. You have 5 minutes. Your Honor, distinguished members of defense, jury, and knowledgeable audience, I'm here as a witness, as one more of those that we live in the state of Oaxaca, fortunately. And yesterday we had the best promotion, having the participation of Alejandro Davila. Thousands of national, international tourists visit us. We are tourism as the main driver of the economy, and we have more than $1 billion a year. The attraction of Oaxaca is based in its environmental and cultural diversity. That is during the Guelaguetza events or the celebrations of the days of the death in November, and its cuisine. We are attracted by tlayudas, mezcal, and its food. With the perspective of also use the calenda, and you yesterday enjoyed the calenda, by the way. The mountains of the northern areas and the shorelines are one characteristic of Oaxaca, just like Monte Alban, that they also are considered as a mankind jewel. Before the Guelaguetza, the inhabitants of Oaxaca, we see many bureaucrats that were having some paint on their hands because they are working on the facades in the downtown area. But during this time, only the downtown area and only the facades of the different buildings. And it's not something spontaneous. They're sent out so that tourism will not see how we have the deterioration of these facades during the rest of the year. And we should not talk about the rest of the year. The best analogy that we have for tourism in Oaxaca, probably the lovers of Oaxaca, they don't know that probably we have extreme poverty in Oaxaca and racism. And eco-tourists or participants of museums will not know about the severe case of water scarcity that we have or the Atoyac pollution, and that is what you will see on your way to Montalban. The visitors in November, they don't know that the Catrinas parade are more related to the James Bond film and not with our inheritance. And also with the boom of mezcal is representing also damage for our biodiversity. What are museums doing? And I want to tell you. And also these areas so that we will go behind those facades and to see what is the fragile situation that we're facing. And I would say that there will be very few exceptions. And it is seen that those that are visiting the tomb number 7 in Montalban will come out of there without knowing that the Mixtecos, Zapotecos people are still alive and that their lifestyle is not similar to or is not similar to what you will be able to see in different events. And by the way, it's a lot better, believe me. And cultural and policies and their actors have built up facades of hashtags and also trip advisors, stars, and flyers about different sites, ignoring some other sites, those that are not part of the top 10. For example, the pre-Hispanic settlements in Cerro de las Minas and Yegolo, which are covered with graffiti or are neglected, and many community museums that are neglected by official sources. If you don't believe me, just look at these brochures, and here I have evidence. It's the ones that we are receiving out here. And we can say that that's a fact that you will not find known of those 12 community museums that we have in less than an hour away from Oaxaca. So before the tourism case in Oaxaca and cultural sites, we haven't done enough work to go beyond the facade and just to have centralism and uninformed consumption. Our crime is not that of action, but rather of omission. It's not an interested omission because, by the way, many of the museums are free. And to have more tourism is not something that will be an economic driver. This is my speech, and I hope that it will help for this trial that is taking place. Thank you so much. Our third and last witness, Ms. Ximena Escalera Zamudio. You have 5 minutes. Good mornings to all of you, Your Honor, witnesses, jury, and audience. I need to acknowledge that my position as a witness is a difficult one. Therefore, for you to understand my standing, I would like to give you the following topics. We need to know that we are here because of what has happened between the museum and tourism, and then to go to the beginning of my story. The question that I have been asked is blunt. The museum that is basically giving the different cultures that are exhibited and they are at harm. But how can we point the museum that is guilty if I'm part of that phenomenon? How can we keep an objective standing before this case? I can assure that sometimes the museum has no other option, but it's just the prey of that situation and accepting the demands of tourism and to be adjusted to their demands in order to exist or to survive, because this tourism that we have qualified in different occasions as a predator will make the museum and to have a modification in its mission to counteract the effects that this phenomenon implies. So I would like to back up my positioning with my story as an evidence. I'm a direct witness of this project, which is known as Las Pozas. It's in Heledd, in a faraway area in the Huasteca Potosina in Mexico. By the end of the 40s, Edward James, its creator, bought 37 acres of land to have an orchid plantation. In 1962, there's no concluded with a crop, and he decided to start with a garden, and those plans were guided by using concrete in bars, therefore creating different constructions with organic shapes that will coexist with the flora and fauna of that area. When he died in 1984, his garden was floating in the limbo without knowing what the destination would be, and until it was opened officially in 2002 to be visited. Therefore, the best kept secret of the Huasteca stopped being a secret, and it became also a public dominion. But who's guilty? Tourism, because they wanted to know a place that is presented in all touristic promotion campaigns of Mexico and the social media, or those who are responsible to promote a large number of tourism, even though they don't have the right conditions to receive all those tourists. Last year, they could receive only 333,000 visitors. Of course not. And I must share the constant crisis of that identity, and I'm part of that. The garden is not a garden, even though it has many flowers and trees, but it's not also a place to go to swim. It's not a park, and it's not even an archaeological site. It has been the time to define the garden, what it is, and to make it a museum. Probably a simple site, it not complies with the parameters of a museum. However, it's a space that serves community, that keeps a collection, that carries out research, presents the natural and cultural heritage, is mankind heritage, and also is receiving thousands and thousands of tourists. Now, let's briefly go and to see what is the vision of this space. This Edward James Garden needs to be acknowledged as a mixed place by understanding that it is a communion between the natural and culture, which is identified because it is a window of opportunity to have the local and regional development of Huasteca. Here we have one important part for my testimony. The presence of the garden to speak about different opportunities that will benefit communities surrounding it. But this is true, of course. The economy of Gilitla is based on that side, and it is increasing year after year, especially if it was called the Magic Town. But the economic benefits do not necessarily are translated into community ties. There are many people of the community that have been swimming in that area, but they have never been to the area where the structures are, and they don't know Edward Germs works. Probably just seen it from a distance. Local community has lost the importance in that garden, especially the new generations. They are tired of having to share it with thousands of tourists. They rather stay away from it. So it is a fact that youth have more working opportunities because of that garden, but also they are less interested. The community do not have this emotional tie and reject it because they feel that it's not theirs anymore. The garden has been a place where going in there is not a free. There is an organization that maintains it, but also this organization has rules and set new ways of leaving that garden in order to have a better coexistence inside it. The effects of tourism make local community to stay away, and precisely that is why I'm testifying in this court, and just to say that I have seen too much large amounts of tourists that have made this garden to be close to collapse. The site is being destructed. This heritage can be lost, that loss of community ties, deterioration of flora and fauna, but also tourism has made the decisions that will be made from now on, which are decisions which are basically aimed to safeguard the garden. These are the effects that are making for this space to have this urgency to be reformulated and to have a different concept based on the demands of the public. Please conclude because you run out of your time. It's not that the museum will be adjusted to tourism demands. No, the new policies will make for the visitors to be more limited on their behavior in that site. And in this case, I understand the museum is guilty, where definitely the weight of tourism in decision-making processes is a big one, and the mission of the place is compromised. That is why, as I said at the beginning of my testimony, my standing is a difficult one. The tourism is the one that makes us to modify what we were, our mission, the way we think, the way we relate to each other. However, we're not the villains. We are rather shaped that it can be adapted or die. Thank you very much. Now we will have the defense. Professor Sharon.
Your Honour, counsel for the prosecution, expert witnesses, and ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I begin my defence by asking what and who is a tourist. I would like you, the members of the jury, to ask yourself some questions and reflect. Have you ever been a cultural tourist? Have you ever visited a museum or a cultural institution as a tourist? What was your experience there? What did you learn? How were you enriched by that visit? After hearing the prosecution's case, I begin to wonder, what is our fear of tourism based on? Is it a type of cultural snobbery? Is it based on the idea that we, the culture professionals, are the cultural connoisseurs? That we travel to expand our minds, to meet with colleagues, to research and to explore. But the mass, the others, are mere tourists. I think this is a middle-class conceit. I think it speaks from a position of privilege. Often in the museum sector, we worry about reaching communities that don't come to our museums. We worry that our communities don't understand their cultural capital. But tourism and cultural regeneration can help build and support cultural capital, and it can also provide investment and jobs. I wonder if we are nervous that if we include cultural tourists in our audience development plans, that we will leave somebody else out. But surely, I would argue, if we cater for tourists well, we cater for our local communities well. Who do we think we are excluding if we are including cultural tourists? Should we put one group of visitors above another? Students who save to travel and are going on a gap year and want to explore other countries, should we exclude them? Pensioners who are making the most of their retirement, should we exclude them? Families who are taking day trips or hard-earned holidays, either domestically or internationally, should we exclude them? I argue that cultural tourism can build a strong sense of place and identity. I'll give you some examples of that from the UK. 2 years ago, we had the Great Exhibition of the North in Newcastle and Gateshead. The north of England, in many parts, is a post-industrial society. The exhibition attracted 3.8 million visits, over 300 events, over 80 days. What's important, though, is 85% of local residents said they felt proud to have that exhibition in the region, and 84% of visitors said they would recommend it to family and friends. Another example from the UK is when Hull, a city in the northeast of England, became the UK City of Culture in 2017. When that was announced, people laughed. They said, what culture is there in Hull? And when the City Council had asked, in preparation for the announcement, local residents what they would say about Hull to people from outside the area, they said, Hull smells of fish. And that's because it's a fishing economy and a fishing industry in that city. The UK City of Culture attracted a total audience of 5.3 million, attending 2,800 events. Over half of the audiences were from Hull, and 95% of the residents of that city attended at least one cultural activity. The value of that tourism was in excess of £300 million, and it created 800 new jobs. But the real legacy is that now 3 out of 4 residents of that city say they are proud to live in Hull. The last example is Derry, a city in Northern Ireland. Derry, as many of you will know, is better known as the birthplace of the Troubles. It was the City of Culture in 2013, and it's now a key tourist attraction in Northern Ireland. The former military barracks on one side of the city, where 1,000 British troops were garrisoned in 1972, has been developed into a cultural centre with 10,000 capacity for cultural events. And that city has now got a 10-year cultural strategy. And my point is that when you create a tourist showcase, local people benefit. In answer to some of the prosecution's points around playing to the masses and the idea perhaps of Disneyfication, why do we think that tourists don't want the radical, intellectual, challenging programming that other visitors want? Do not underestimate the tourist audience. On sustainability, yes, there is a climate crisis and we have to tackle that. But there are ways for museums to encourage and incentivise sustainable actions, using public transport, for example, as the National Trust does in the UK. Last year, in 2017 rather, it was the United Nations International Year for Sustainable Tourism. The 3 pillars of sustainable tourism are employing environmentally friendly practices, reduce, reuse, recycle, protecting cultural and natural heritage and restoring historic buildings, and providing tangible social and economic benefits for local communities. These are the things that we can and should do, but we should also have that conversation about climate crisis in every single one of our museums and galleries. We should weigh up and balance the cost of one tourist coming to our museum and the benefit to the planet of them being exposed and engaged with our collections, with our programming, and going home and living and behaving and thinking in a different way. Your Honour, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I finish on this point. Decolonisation has been a topic of conversation in this conference, and that will continue tomorrow. 2 weeks ago in Paris, there was a seminar of African cultural leaders, and at that seminar, they made the case for the return of their cultural heritage. And they said, we need our cultural heritage back because we need to use it to teach the new generations about our rich and diverse cultural heritage. And we need it back because we want to create a tourist economy. Tourism matters to museums. We live in challenging times of intolerance and fear of the other. If we expand our horizons, if we see beyond narrow, petty boundaries, we see new cultures. We see different peoples, different ways of living and being. And that is what cultural tourism can bring. Thank you.
Very well, so now we will have the defense witnesses. First, we have Joel Aguilar from Mexico, and I think that he comes accompanied by a tourist. Hello. Listening to the other side, defending the no use of tourism. Precisely, we are here to present our case. I would like to start by introducing Rafa. He is a MOAC guard, and he's going to be presenting his experience with the public. The cases that have been presented so far present tourists in museums as being adverse and negative, but we also need to say that cultural tourists, and I think that all of us who are here at a certain point of our lives have been cultural tourists. So we have something that local communities do not have for their museums. And this is something that all museums have a problem with at all times. What we do call as cultural tourism, we generate income. All the different studies that have been done on museum visitors, we said that those that will consume more at the restaurant and the store will be the cultural tourism, but not local tourism. They have other kind of interest that is related to workshops, but they do not represent heavy income for the museum. And in this case, all this kind of income allow the museum to survive, to pay for maintenance, to keep up with the maintenance, to have lights working, restrooms, and also they have many other public programs that will make workshops to be more economical, specifically for local audience. And in some cases, like in Moy, they are even supporting to buy also works to have more collection in the museum. And Rafa will give us the experience. Hello, I am Rafa, and I'm one of the guards at the MOAC Museum. Thank you, thank you. And based on my experience, I can tell you that ever since I've met Joel and some other tourists, international tourists, my life has been happier because now I'm not getting bored in those halls. In the past, I had a lot of free time and I was watching videos on YouTube, and that's what I did all day long. But now I'm able to have an exchange of experiences. I can also share culture, and sometimes I even go on trips with them. So for me, it is really important to have tourism because that is an incentive and will benefit the museum, and not only the museum but also the context of the museum and the country as well. And my friends, the guards of the Louvre, they complain a lot because they said that they have high traffic. But I would be so happy if I were there because I know that they have a great time. So I would say that, and I'm in favor of having many tourism. So what could we do with these museums if we only have local visitors? So that is my experience. And just to close, I would like to say that something very important that the prosecutor should have said. What do we rather is for the museum to die of fame or to die because it has been neglected? And I think if we have a good visitors management program, we both can coexist and both things can perfectly work together. Thank you. Our next witness of the defense, directly from Paraguay, Damián Cabrera. Good afternoon. I will have a brief testimony. I think that Paraguay is not necessarily an important touristic destination. It's an area surrounded by land and also a shelter of a traveler at a certain point. Probably is not a touristic destination, but it has been a colonial destination. I would like to talk about tourism and its relationship with specific privileges and with one specific industry that think about the experiencing culture as a part of consumption, and it implies the decision of consuming and for paying those products that will be consumed. The migrant subjects, those that are the travelers or that they're looking a new place to have a future, those subjects that needed to be in this place because of economic or political situations, they participate by experimenting the space, and that probably we can call it as well tourism. And the museum probably can offer a way to build up community knowledge, dialogue, and that probably that will allow to have more knowledge of that place that is being occupied or that you're visiting. not only the travelers that are on their way to Sao Paulo or Buenos Aires, they need to stop in Asunción, and they visit the museum that is a few minutes away from the airport. And those are tourists. Yes, there are also tourists, the indigenous people that take their selfie in front of Luis Felipe Noel painting. Could it be that we could say that students are also tourists, the academicians that travel, that need to go through the different borders and to use and to experiment the place, to leave the place, to consume it in the geophasic way? In visual arts in the Clay Museum, we have guided tours for students of Paraguay. This is to support mobility and specifically for transportation and to offer playing activities and offering also one meal. That is what we can offer. This is a tourism that is fostered by the institution itself, as a relative that sends out a ticket to a faraway relative to come and visit them. And children, sometimes they do not only have one single opportunity to leave for those sites of origin, but to visit a museum,
where they can familiarize themselves with indigenous and popular activities, especially when you come from an indigenous community. Sometimes they even see that the things that they produce in their own hometowns are highly valued in other places. This could also be very helpful to improve their self-esteem. But for a lot of people, it's also an opportunity to be in contact with learned assets. And obviously, the fact that these indigenous works of art are in a museum, they are considered wonderful works of art. Perhaps that type of tourism is not something that they need. This other type of tourism is not something that they need, but it can most definitely be a wonderful opportunity for them. Thank you. The defense would like to ask for its last witness for the defense from Wales to please come up. Tienes 5 minutos.
Your Honour, members of the jury, apart from today, where I've been saying, yes, I do match the courtroom, the sentence I have said the most since arriving in Oaxaca has been, me llamo Heledd, soy de Gales. Knowing I would be part of today's trial, I have been collecting evidence, especially for you, of how many people have said, oh, that's in England, when I have said I come from Wales. So 16 people have been to Wales or know about it through their own knowledge, or, I have to say, because of watching the television series The Crown, something which I, since I'm not a fan of the monarchy, have not watched myself. 14 people are very lucky to be alive for thinking that my country is in England as opposed to being a country next door to England, with its own language, Welsh, a Gymraeg, and culture. And Your Honour, I have kept their names for you, and some of them are here if you want to put them on trial for crimes against Wales later today. Why is this relevant? Well, I tell you this as someone who is protective of my language and culture, but also as someone who's proud of it and wants to share it with the world. And I believe that the best way for this to happen is if more people come to Wales and experience it for themselves. Which brings me to my own institution, National Museum Wales, or Amgueddfa Cymru. We are a family of 7 museums which are across Wales and are home to the national collections of art, social history, natural sciences, and the industrial history of Wales. Our vision is inspiring people, changing lives. And central to our thinking is Article 27 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which states that everybody has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community. This really came to life in the recent redevelopment of St Fagan's National Museum of History, where we applied a new way of working with cultural democracy at its heart. Over 120 organisations worked with us on this project, leading to thousands of people participating in the transformation of the museum and remaining a part of its work now. It also led to the museum being awarded Art Fund Museum of the Year 2019 earlier this year, with the judges stating, "This magical place was made by the people of Wales for people everywhere and stands as one of the most welcoming and engaging museums anywhere in the UK." And it's certainly proving popular with visitors because there are better facilities for them, but also because they are attracted by this new way of working. And though entry to the museum is free, they are increasing spend in the shop and cafe and parking, and its social mission has not been compromised. I would also like to put forward as evidence one of our museums that reflects the industrial history of Wales, specifically Big Pit in Blaenavon in South Wales, a museum that is based around the former Big Pit colliery, where visitors can descend into the old colliery and experience it for themselves. It plays a key role in the regeneration of its locality, both as an employer and also through the programs it runs, helping to tackle social isolation, and also crucially with the programs it runs with former miners suffering from dementia, where the experience of going underground has helped unlock memories and enable some to communicate once more with their families. But it is also a place that supports cultural tourism and benefits local businesses, whilst also being a place of cultural exchange where visitors can share their own experiences. This creates dialogue between cultures and increases awareness of the things that connects rather than divides us. We shouldn't just seek to inspire our visitors, but we must be open to learn and to be inspired by them. A museum cannot properly fulfill its social mission if it denies the rights of its community to directly tell its story to the world and for visitors to share their stories with them. Thank you.
The effort on the part of the prosecution and the defense has brought us to a very difficult point in which we have to reach a decision. And I would ask myself if any of you members of the jury, have ever had enough experience so as to, in 2 minutes, say something that the rest of us should hear. You can come up to the stage. We're trying to be as democratic as possible. Does anybody in the jury want to stand up and in just 2 minutes explain what their experience with tourism has been, either for or against tourism? Are there any volunteers? Would you like to come up to the stage, please, and talk for just 2 minutes? My name is Marcos, and I'm going to speak out on behalf of the Ethnobotanic Garden in Vallarta. Most of our visitors are tourists, American tourists. In Vallarta, we have a serious problem because the city has grown quite a bit, and it's destroying the jungle. But thanks to tourism, the botanical gardens have been able to grow and create a private reserve. I think that the original garden has grown by 400% thanks to the donations that foreign tourists have made to our organization. So in my experience, yes, on the one hand, it destroys the jungle, but it has also helped us to conserve nature. And I don't know if that's an argument for the defense or for the prosecution, but thank you for your indecision. Any other volunteers? We have somebody over here. You've got 2 minutes, please. Hello, Your Honor, and members of the defense and the prosecution. My name is Paulina Robera. I'm the head of communication at the Pre-Columbian Art Museum. In Argentina? Yes. Hello, Piñera. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what we do. We're a museum that is about to turn 38 years old. It's a benchmark for our country. It began as a space devoted to research and science, and in which peers were very much involved, but it slowly became somewhere in which only tourists went. If you go to Santiago, you have to go to our museum. Last year we was chosen as the #1 museum in Chile, sorry, not Argentina, and it's very famous in the Southern Cone. But we were looking at who our public was, because we realized that there was a crisis, because a third of our income depends on the tickets. But we also have to play a very important social role, and we wanted to be much closer to our local community, the people in Santiago. And so we find ourselves at a crossroads, because we decided to lower the price of tickets so the local people could come in, but we increased the price for tourists to $10, because they did have the purchasing power to be able to pay for it. And in Chile, unfortunately, we're not really accustomed to paying for our museum visits, and I think that that's another idea that we could work on. Thank you. Thank you. We have time for maybe just one or two more comments. And there's somebody over there in the back. So we've got the last two. Hello, everybody. My name is Alejandra. I'm from Mexico, and I'm here representing the Museum of the Firefly in the state of Tlaxcala. This is a relatively new museum, and it was created because we were aware of the fact that fireflies are dying off. We've seen a 50% decrease in the firefly population in the area, and so the museum was created in order to find a way to help the species of firefly to recover, while at the same time encouraging tourism. And this was something that was undertaken by the university to that end. So we believe that tourism could be also a source of spreading the word of the importance of conserving and preserving, rather, this natural and cultural heritage that we have in fireflies. But it's also a permanent risk, because we might be destroying the firefly environment. Thank you. And over there, oh, he's over here already. All right. Hello, good afternoon. For a long time, I worked at the Museum of Light, which belongs to the National University of Mexico, which was in the San Pedro San Pablo temple. And now it is a museum that has the documents of the Constitution, and people would come in because they thought it was a temple, that it was a church. And when we would tell people about the electromagnetic spectrum, everybody paused and they didn't know where to put their little candle, because they had thought it was a church. And at one point we had to turn off the lights in the Museum of Light. No, we didn't have enough tourists coming in. Instead of that, we had a lot of street hawkers who came in with their posters asking that we not remove that museum from that community, from that neighborhood. So we hope you visit us in Yucatan, because it was downtown initially, but then they moved it somewhere else. And so now we can't find a home for our Museum of the Light. Museum of Light. Thank you. We don't have enough time to hear from the rest of you, but I think that we've heard some very good arguments from both sides of the sector. And so now what I would like you to do is to take the token you have, and as members of the jury, please put your token in one box or the others. One box or the other. The boxes are over here. That one says in favor, and this other one says against. For and against. And then our secretary will count the tokens, so please, in a very orderly fashion, please deposit your token, and then we'll summarize the final results. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, please bring your tokens. This is for, this one is against. When you vote in favor, that means that the museum is innocent, that the museums who adapt to the needs of tourism are innocent. If you vote against, that means that museums that adapt their missions to what tourists expect of them have to be found guilty.
Adaptarse o no adaptarse. Exacto. Veredicto del honorable jurado. Con total transparencia y un ejemplo de civilidad, el jurado ha determinado que inocente, el museo inocente.
Gracias, muchas gracias. Gracias.